things in the British system. And after a lot of toing and froing, we managed to get Merlin Rees, the ex-Home Secretary of Northern Ireland, to come down and say, yes, the only way to do it is for the ministers have to tell the truth even when it's inconvenient. Then after the main events of the trial, as it were, the jury was sent home while we had the legal arguments about what Section 2 meant. Now, there's a clause that in the old Section 2, it's not there now, they took it out, which said you didn't commit an offence if it was your duty in the interest of the state to reveal the information. So that was my defence, that it was my duty to do it, and it was in the interest of the state that Parliament should be told the truth. Not when the judge started on it. He said, well, no, duty, no, I'm not having any of this rubbish about general civic duty. It's whatever your duty was as a senior civil servant. You've been told they didn't want to reveal it, so it can't have been your duty to do it. Then he got to what the interests of the state were. A state's a rather odd thing. You don't really have it very much in English. You know, it's the Crown or whatever. But anyway, no, he said, right, well, I'm going to rule that the interests of the state are the same as the interests of the government of the day. And so then he said, well, in the light of that, I don't think I've got any choice but to direct the jury to find Mr. Ponting guilty, which is the one thing actually a judge in Britain can't do. They can direct the jury to find you innocent because the evidence isn't up to it, but they can't direct the jury to find you guilty. At this point, the remarkable thing happened. Roy Amlott, who was the prosecutor, the QC, stood up and said, well, my lad, there must be something that could be put before the jury. No, I'm not having any of that. He said, well, could we have an adjournment for a quarter of an hour? But if you want to, you can. And we know what happened. I mean, I heard that afterwards. They went to the Attorney General and they said, can the government stand a direction to convict? And he decided against it as too politically embarrassing. So a quarter of an hour later, the judge comes back and says, well, I've looked up a few precedents and I've decided not to do that. But of course, then his summing up was regarded as one of the most biased anybody had ever come across. I mean, he didn't actually direct them to find me guilty, but he did everything he could short of that. So anyway, in the end, the jury took about, well, we know they took about 25 minutes to find me not guilty. This was at about 11:30. Decided they'd have a free lunch off the state before they came back. And we had the verdict at about 2:00. So, well, after all of that, I had to decide what I was going to do with life. And I moved down to Wales and for a while ran a organic smallholding whilst doing some freelance writing. But I'd already, the people at the politics department at Swansea University had asked me to do things for them, and one thing led on to another, and I finished up as a reader in politics and international relations there for nearly 15 years. And then took early retirement because they were giving a ludicrously generous package, and we moved to a small Greek island for 7 years. In the end, we decided to move because, yes, it's very nice there, it was lovely, but we were 5 hours from a hospital on the boat, and you know, as you get more ancient, it's not really a good idea. So we decided to move to France, where we lived for 7 years. And I think we would probably have stayed there. But Brexit made it fairly clear that we weren't going to be able to, particularly once May had given a Lancaster House speech, which made it pretty clear, and I think it's still clear now, that the odds are that there'll be no deal because of the red lines, etc. And we were not in, and I in particular was not in a position not to have medical care. When you're a pensioner in France, you get the same medical care as a French pensioner, and it's very, very good, and the British pay for it. But that's an EU scheme, which will go. And also, neither my civil service pension nor either of our state pensions would be increased with inflation. It'd be frozen at whatever level. And you can survive on that for a couple of years maybe, but then it gets a bit more difficult. So why did we come to Scotland? Well, I'd always loved Scotland. I knew it quite well. It started actually when I was 17, and a friend and I, we did the week rail rover. We were both mad railway buffs, and we did the week rail rover around Scotland, with the great highlights, obviously, of the North Line from Inverness up to the far north, and then the West Highland out to Mallaig, the boat to Skye, and then from Kyle back up to Inverness, and of course the Waverley Line. I'd also spent a fair amount of time here with Ministry of Defence. One of my jobs was looking after Yarrow shipbuilders down on the Clyde, who for rather nefarious reasons, the Tory government had given them a large loan, and I looked after that with them. So I used to come up to there and for ship launches and stuff, and then some walking in the Highlands. And then when I was teaching at Swansea and afterwards, used to do quite a bit with the environmental department at Edinburgh. So I came here quite a lot of time. And we wanted to move to somewhere that was actually, you had a sense of community and a decent government, unlike in England. So we decided 2 years ago now, we would come to the borders. We spent a week here driving around, just familiarising ourselves. We stayed in Kelso, and it was not long before Christmas 2 years ago, and we fell in love with Kelso the moment we drove into the town square with all the Christmas lights, and it just seemed a lovely place to be. And we finally moved here about a year ago after we sold our place in France. And it was only about 2 days after we got here that we realised we'd made the right choice. We were in Gala doing some shopping, and we were just talking to the girl behind the till and said, we'd only just moved to Scotland. And the lady behind us in the queue said, "Welcome to Scotland. I hope you'll be very happy here." And I just thought that was just so nice. Anyway, so why the SNP? Well, obviously being in France, we didn't have a vote in 2014, but I would have voted yes. Obviously I'm not Scottish, so we come at it, I think, from a different sort of perspective. And it seems to me, I'll come back to it, that independence is simply the only chance Scotland's got in the current situation. In the 1970s, when devolution and the SNP started to get somewhere, I can remember very clearly the fear, it is in Whitehall, the fear, the condescension, and actually the hatred that was being expressed about Scotland. And that's why, of course, the 40% was put in the first devolution revolution, because they were determined to try and stop Scotland getting its hands on the money, the oil. So where do I start from? Well, I start from the fact that Britain isn't a nation. It's what historians call a composite monarchy, like Spain and like the dear old Habsburg Empire, a collection of territories put together under one monarch. Scotland, quite clearly, as you well know, is a nation. I mean, one of the things we used to try and tell our first-year politics students was the difference between a nation and a state, and Scotland is the best example of a nation that isn't a state. Any country that has its own laws, its own education system, its own church, its own history is clearly a nation. The main problem with Britain, of course, is that federalism will not work. It works in places like Germany or America. It can't work in Britain because England is such a large proportion of the country, 80% or so. So it would be completely unbalanced. So what about the attitude of the parties? Well, the Liberals were always for Home Rule, of course, Home Rule all round. But now I'm afraid that they're irrelevant. Labour has obviously always been for the Union, and now I think it's worse in that their last hope of regaining power in Westminster is to get back the seats that they used to hold in Scotland. They can't win a majority. I mean, Labour has only about once ever won a majority of the seats in England. Now, they were for devolution, of course, because they thought they'd control it, which indeed they did for a while. And the idea of having PR in the Scottish Parliament was so that the SNP couldn't get total control of it. Then we turn to the Conservatives. Well, they've been the Unionist party since 1886. That's when the Liberals split over Home Rule for Ireland. And don't forget, only just over 100 years ago, the Conservatives and Unionists were prepared to see civil war in Britain in order to stop Ulster becoming part of a united Ireland under Home Rule, not even independent. They've always opposed devolution, except, of course, in Northern Ireland. And indeed, Northern Ireland is the only part of Britain that can freely choose to leave the Union whenever it wants to, under the Good Friday Agreement. And they know that the only way they'll ever be able to control Scotland is by keeping it in the Union and centralising. After all, they've never won a majority of the parliamentary seats in Scotland since 1955, and they're even less likely to do so now, I think. And they were Cameron was obviously opposed to devolution max in 2014 because he knew it would be chosen. Probably instead of independence, there would have been a massive vote in favour of Devo Max. Now, I think the current situation is incredibly dangerous, actually, for Scotland. There's no doubt that the Conservatives see Brexit as the way to completely neuter devolution, and they intend to do it. They're ruthless enough to do it. They say, and I can't imagine who would be naive enough to believe them, that the powers that are coming back from Brussels will only be held centrally on a temporary basis for 7 years. I don't think anybody is stupid enough, quite honestly, to believe that sort of stuff. And if it is no deal, I think it's inevitable that the government will take emergency powers to deal with the problems. And I know what some of the emergency powers are because I drafted them for the run-up to nuclear war, and they're not likely to be that much different. And it is not impossible that the emergency powers will actually dissolve the Scottish Parliament. Well, as Andrew said, we joined, like a lot of other people, in the spring. We were going to vote SNP anyway. But the last straw was the way they conducted themselves over the withdrawal bill, which was quite simply appalling on any grounds. The lack of debate, which was quite deliberate. They lied and lied and lied. And then the man who drafted the consent part of the bill really needs looking at his conscience to define